got this. Oh, bless you. Bless you.
You know he loves to talk. You know.
All you have to do is read that.
Yeah, I'm going to read it as fast as possible.
Pretend everyone's in their underwear. I can make you sweat.
No, not in my work.
He has some microphones.
Yeah,
they
pretty
on?
swanky.
Do you want to sit or you want to stand with him?
Never done this before.
No. I mean, it might be more embarrassing if you stand. Otherwise, it might be all right. I don't know. Oh yeah, how did we stop that? Thank God, we can see it on the screen.
It's all right.
Okay, should we do it?
Yeah.
Is it time?
Yeah.
Is it coming in? Hi everyone! Is this thing on? This thing's on. Thanks for joining us. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague Anamik Saha this evening. Anamik first joined us at Leeds in 2010, first as an ESRC postdoctoral fellow and then as a lecturer. We spent a lot of time together back then, and one day we were talking about whether we would want to work in the US. And this then junior scholar comes out with, "I'd consider a visiting professorship at Duke." To which I responded, "Oh, would you? Would you consider it?" And mocked him mercilessly for many years. More recently, I've realized I wouldn't be surprised if Duke invited Anamik to be a visiting professor. So what happened between then and now? At the end of 2013, Anamik left us and returned to Goldsmiths, where he had earlier completed his degrees. And in the following years, Anamik established himself, as you all know, as a leading figure in the study of race and media. So his 2018 book, Race in the Cultural Industries, is a really rare look at the production of representations of race. It became an instant classic. His 2021 book, Race, Culture, and Media, is the go-to book for students and scholars who want a grounding in the key issues and ideas relevant to the study of media and race. And these contributions, of course, join important reports that he's co-authored, groundbreaking special issues, and a long list of articles in the top journals in the field. But Anamik, our Anamik, is no workaholic, no. His accomplishments beyond academia include persuading Kara to marry him, bringing 2 beautiful children into the world, being an Arsenal season ticket holder, drumming for multiple bands, including the polarizing Reviewer 2, new EP now available on Bandcamp. Yep. And let's not even start on his lustrous hair, all his own. For all of these reasons, my Leeds colleagues and I were absolutely thrilled to welcome Anamik back to the school, this time as Professor of Race and Media in 2022. Given his expertise, it is perhaps surprising that tonight he will lead a call to end diversity. Anamik will argue in this talk that white people have made an awful lot of really good, excellent, in fact, media, so maybe we should just lay off the whole diversity thing. I'm joking, of course. His talk will explore the shortcomings of diversity initiatives and discourse in addressing inequalities, and I have no doubt that Anamik is going to bring another of his many gifts to the topic, which is his ability to address really important issues of injustice in a way that galvanizes rather than depresses. So I give you Professor Anamik Saha.
Hi, everyone. Oh, wow. Thank you, Bethany, for that introduction. Very generous. Can I just say, the Duke thing was off the back of, I had a lovely holiday in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So that was, it was a hypothetical. I'm so proud to be here and grateful to have you all at this event. I know many of you have travelled quite far to be here as well, which is really super generous. I think, as Bethany alluded to, this is my second, well, not alluded to, you spoke quite directly to, this is my second stint at Leeds. I rejoined the department last year. Those who know me know that I've basically bounced between the University of Leeds and Goldsmiths, University of London. I did all my education at Goldsmiths, including a BA in Communication Studies and a PhD. They call it Communications, by the way. I don't know why they put an S on the end of communication. Here we singular, but anyway, Communication Studies, and then a PhD in Sociology, and it's wonderful to see some friends from that time there, including my supervisor, Michael Keefe, who right now is kind of looking very, very embarrassed. Michael was an amazing supervisor throughout the thesis. He showed real patience and tolerance, I think, are the two watchwords. But, and any inaccuracies in that thesis are all his fault. So thank you so much for coming. After my PhD, I got a postdoc at the University of Leeds, where I worked with David Hesmanhouch, who unfortunately can't be here today. David had a big influence on my career, but he taught me at Goldsmiths. I followed him to Leeds, then became a lecturer in what was then known as the Institute of Communication Studies. And then after 3.5 years, I returned back to Goldsmiths. And then after 8 years, they've come back here as a professor in race and media. I'm just going to milk that just for a little second there. Incidentally, though, this bouncing between Goldsmiths and Leeds actually goes back past my professional career, in that when I was 17, I went to 2 university open days, Goldsmiths and the University of Leeds. But as my daughters would say, Leeds is actually the OG, as you can tell by this picture here, which is of me and my family. That was at my sister's graduation, I want to say 30 years ago, 1993. And no, that's definitely 1993. And yeah, so it's, by the way, that suede waistcoat I'm wearing, that's Model's Own, I'll have you know. So thank you. I'm so grateful for those 2 institutions for helping to shape who I am today, the researcher, the person I am. I consider both the Department of Media and Communication Studies at Goldsmiths and the School of Media and Communication here at Leeds as the 2 best departments in the field. But I'm so grateful to come back to, let's call it SMC, it rolls off the tongue a bit faster, who gave me my first proper break at academia. So it's a thrill to return and to give back to this department. That means so much to me. And honestly, like, really amazing colleagues, like, across the board, like, all of them. It is ridiculous. I feel very privileged to be here. Before I start, I want to thank my mentors, colleagues and friends, many of whom are in this room right now, people who have helped and supported me, people who have inspired me, people who have helped make work so much fun. Thankfully, I kind of laugh a lot at work, which is a nice feeling to have, and that's thanks to really wonderful colleagues. There's too many to name individually, so I won't, but you know who you are, so thank you so much. I want to thank, I will name some people though, my immediate family. I want to thank my mum and my dad for instilling belief in me, for trusting in me, supporting all of my endeavours. In some ways, they are your classic, stereotypical Asian parents. When I called my dad to tell him that I'd got a lectureship at Leeds, his first response was, When are you going to become a professor? So that was like straight off the bat. 8 years, 10 years, I can't remember how many years, but anyway, I'm here now. But actually, the way they raised me exposed how false these ridiculous stereotypes are. And like those times they'd come and see my band play at a punk venue, or even more radically, those times they let me and my sister study media studies at university. So, thank you. I want to thank my sister Paramita for being such a big influence on me, whether like my cultural tastes or indeed my academic interests, actually. She's, as you can tell, she's much older than me. But nonetheless, and so she's had a big influence. And as a tribute, sis, I'm going to keep this picture up of you a little bit longer because I know how much you love it. Cara, my wife, has been here from the start. We started going out during my master's dissertation back in 2001, and so more than anyone has seen the trials and tribulations of my academic career, though, quite frankly, I think she thinks I'm just doss around, actually, I think is what, I don't think Cara sees me work that hard. So yeah, I wouldn't be here without her love and support, nor would I be in these wicked threads. And my daughters, Latika and Uma, according to Latika and Uma, it doesn't matter the context, it doesn't matter what social situation I am in, who I am talking to, I will always somehow, according to my daughters, bring the conversation back to diversity, or as Uma would say, race and the cultural media. Media is inherently cultural. It's like saying chai tea. It doesn't make any sense. But anyway. Well, you know what, girls? I have followed your advice. So today, I am going to argue that we need to end all diversity talk. And I promise you this is the last time I will say the D word again. Okay? Happy? On a bit more of a serious note, I just want to dedicate this talk to my mentor, colleague, and friend, Casper Melville. Casper was my undergraduate dissertation supervisor, and more than anyone is perhaps the reason why I'm here today. Over the summer, he was involved in a serious accident and is on a very long road to recovery. So I know he would have loved to have been here. He would have not come because he's loath to leave South London. But nonetheless, I know he was really happy for me when he heard about this post. So this talk is dedicated to him. Okay. So in this talk, I'll call for the end of diversity. And yeah, just to clarify, this isn't going to be a Lawrence Fox-style tirade against white culture or, excessive political correctness and excessive diversity. I have presented different versions of this argument. I think many of you in this room have probably seen me rabbit on about this issue. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach this time. And kind of actually, just in the spirit of inaugurals and, in indulging myself, please forgive me, I'm going to kind of maybe start off with a bit of personal biography to kind of help you understand where I've come from, how I've reached these ideas, and indeed why I claim that we need to end diversity, though I stress again from an anti-racist perspective. I want to start off with this image here. So many of you who I've worked with might recognize it. I have this postcard on my office. For every office I've worked in, this has been stuck on there. It depicts a young Asian punk from the late 1970s, I'm thinking. It comes from a photography exhibition called Changing Faces from 2003 that captured British South Asian experience since the 1970s. Incidentally, my first ever publication in a very obscure journal was on this exhibition. Specifically the involvement, I don't know if you can see it, but the sponsorship of telecommunication company O2, this was the idea for their exhibition came from O2, and it was part of what they called their ethnic communication strategy. This is from 2003, remember, which was an attempt to engage more Asian communities, because we love our mobile phones, as everyone knows. And so that article was the start of my interest in the politics of commodification in relation to race, the commodification of race, essentially. This image really speaks to me. I grew up in God's own country, Ilford, Essex. To be very precise, it's on the border of London and Essex. It's a tremendously diverse area. When my family arrived, it was predominantly white and Jewish. Mostly people from working class backgrounds who had made a bit of money during the Thatcher years. You know, they were builders and taxi drivers. Asians started migrating there from East London, much like the Jewish community before them. And by the time I'd started secondary school, my class was a third white, a third Jewish, and a third Asian, a mix of Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh. So the politics of race and multiculturalism were kind of there from the start. It was a tough place to feel attached to. Despite the diversity, racial hostility felt like the background white noise, and racist skinheads were an occasional presence in our town. But there were also moments of conviviality too, especially high school, where our cultural differences became the source of good-natured banter, juvenile and plural, I should add, but hilarious nonetheless. What complicated things for me slightly was how, thanks to my sister, I fell in love with rock music, and then alternative rock. And then I switched from being a fan and a listener to an active participant in London's kind of underground DIY indie scene from the time. Encouraged by my parents, who bought me my first drum kit, I formed a band with some of the kids in my class. And in that moment, I had to learn to be the only brown face in a very white scene, a very handy skill to have in academia. Again, this made me super attuned and attentive to the politics of race, in a different way to my Asian friends who found, formed really strong bonds in their community and found their strength in numbers, essentially. The scene I was in was a fairly welcoming space, and I very rarely encountered explicit racism. But nonetheless, I felt like what Nirmal Pura calls, how the sociologist Nirmal Pura puts it, I felt like a space invader. While I do not want to call it an identity crisis, and I think children of migrants can be easily pathologized for being caught between two cultures, that wasn't my experience, certainly. But my participation in the scene was certainly questioned from both sides, explicitly by my Asian friends, and less directly by the white people I met in the scene. University was life-changing. I originally signed up to do communication studies at Goldsmiths to learn film. I wanted to be the new Spike Lee. But very quickly, it was the theoretical side of the degree where I found inspiration. Stuart Hall was not a member of our department, but his presence, he had a very special connection to Goldsmiths, and his presence was felt everywhere. Though I never met him, Paul Gilroy was teaching in the sociology department at the time. And then reading the work of both of these scholars in the classes of Angela McRobbie and David Morley, who had also come through the influential Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, was transformative. So I learned about essentialist versus anti-essentialist versus anti-essentialist versions of culture. I learned that racial and ethnic identity is never fixed. It is fluid, it is always ongoing, it is always coming into being, arriving, to use that very Stuart Hallian phrase, without guarantees. I learned that while race is a social construct, a floating signifier, it produces very real material effects. And in turn, I learned to understand popular culture as a site of hegemonic struggle, the space where power is both secured and challenged. Moreover, through the lectures of David Hesmanhauch, I learned that understanding the operation of this power necessitates an understanding of the political economy of and the cultures of production within the culture industries that produce the very material, or indeed the commodities, that in turn constitute popular culture. And then while learning all this in class, at the time, this is a late night, like the mid to late 1990s, there was something very exciting happening outside. Whilst growing up in the 1980s, Asians in the media were invisible. My sister and I would play this game called Spot the Asian, where we would essentially, between us, watch like hours and hours of television and scream the house down when a brown person appeared, usually Art Malik. It didn't matter that they were only ever shopkeepers or terrorists, it was a form of recognition. But come the mid-90s, a new generation of British-born South Asians were breaking through into mainstream culture. This photo shoot of Asian women appropriating the skinhead subculture that was so violent towards Asians is from a short-lived magazine that was covering this new cultural scene. I think this shoot captures the spirit of the moment. Significantly for me, personally, Asians much more talented than me were infiltrating the very white and punk indie scenes on a national and international level. Here are three bands that mean a lot to me. That's Asian Dub Foundation, the Voodoo Queens, I don't know if anyone remembers them, and then that's Corner Shop there, who are burning, Bethany, you'll like this one, burning a picture of Morrissey over his, even then he was being called out for being a bit of a racist. I wrote my dissertation on these three bands. It was called Asians Can't Rock. And rather than find that they were merely assimilating into white culture, I argue that they were in fact challenging the racism in these scenes and in society as a whole through culture and creativity. This was the time where post-colonial concepts like hybridity and third space were buzzwords in cultural studies. Through their creative practice, British Asians were challenging normative understandings of Asianness, rejecting the stereotype of Asians as passive, conformist, and uncool. And in doing so, they were articulating new ways of being British. This was my interest. This was the start of my interest in race and cultural production. While my starting point was the representation of Black, brown, and Asian people in media, I felt like there was a massive gap in the research. What is the experience of racialized people working inside the cultural industries who are trying to transform the reductive ways that their communities have been historically portrayed? You know, media studies is all about, often just focuses on the representation of these communities. But there's much less interest, until recently at least, in how these representations come about in the first place. This is really important because if we understand popular culture as the space where hegemonic ideas around race are reproduced but also to be challenged, then we need to focus on cultural production in order to formulate effective cultural political strategies. If someone wants to intervene in the politics of representation, then their ability to do so is shaped by their access to and their experience within the means of cultural production, or indeed the culture industries. So over my career, I've researched and written about the experiences of Black and Asian people working in media, the way their practice has been enabled and constrained in certain institutional settings, mostly constrained, I should add, and shaped by broader political, economic, and social cultural currents, whether that's the politics of multiculturalism or the ascendancy of neoliberalism. And in recent times, this has entailed a grappling with the politics of diversity. How you doing, girls? Right. So patient. I'll be another hour, don't worry. Flick through your favourite streaming platforms right now, and Black, brown, and Asian people are having a fantastic time, living extraordinary and ordinary lives. They are falling in love, having children, raising their families, free from harm, i.e. police brutality. They have successful careers in senior positions. They're judges, they're lawyers, they're politicians. They're solving crimes. They are leaders of the free world. They are superheroes fighting supervillains and saving the world from destruction. This is, I watched this, switched on the TV the other day, and there was this horror film which had this, I can't remember the story, but basically this Asian Tory who'd become Prime Minister of the UK. It was terrifying. I switched it off straight away. This is a far cry from Spot the Asian. And it definitely feels like a new distinct moment within the current conjuncture. Herman Gray is an American media studies scholar and sociologist who I admire greatly and has influenced my work tremendously. And I want to reaffirm two of his points. One, we have gone from invisibility to hypervisibility. And secondly, diversity, or to be more precise, the language of diversity, is shaping contemporary race-making practices in media. Let me put it another way. So much of the media we consume is made according to the logic of diversity. So where did this diversity come from? Well, it's firstly, I would argue, it's a product of what Stuart Hall calls multicultural drift. Hall here uses the concept to describe the increasing visibility and natural participation of ethnic minorities in British life through different ways of migration. It is a slow shift, like tectonic plates drifting across ocean beds. Of course, multicultural drift is always under contestation, met with nationalistic resistance that put together and enact social hostile policies designed to halt its progress. Nonetheless, there is something inevitable about multicultural drift, even though it lacks a specific goal. It follows that as society becomes more heterogeneous, as those minoritized populations become more integrated into society, they become more assertive and demand the rights that they have been historically denied. And I think in this moment, diversity describes how the demand for equal rights is playing out in the mainstream, I think, enabled by social media, where the representation and visibility of minoritized groups in public life has become a key social justice goal, something I should add I have serious misgivings about. It also emerges from New Labour's creative industry policy. Diversity as a term has always been present in modern UK cultural policy, and was part of a broader multicultural policy that shaped the state's approach to the arts since the 1970s. But it was instrumentalised by Tony Blair's New Labour in a way to suit its increasingly neoliberal agenda. New Labour wanted to foreground the economic potential of Britain's cultural and creative industries, which provided the justification for the intensification of the marketisation of the creative sector. That was a ridiculous sentence, I'll rewrite that. You know what I'm getting at though. Under creative industry rubric, diversity plays a key role. Diversity is reconceptualised as a driver of innovation, originality, and competition, while aiding social integration and cohesion through increasing the social capital of the individual. The economic case for diversity is in ascendancy and is what shapes culture making in the present. Diversity is also a product of technological change and platform capitalism. There are two facets to this. First is the rise of the new streaming services. These, unlike traditional or legacy media, or traditional commercial media, these services are based on a subscription model where programs are commissioned, made and distributed based not on how much ratings they generate, and therefore advertising revenue, but how they contribute to an overall catalogue, access of which is then sold to customers around the world. In this new production context, content is valued for how it literally adds colour to an existing catalogue or library. A monocultural catalogue is not going to attract subscribers. In other words, diversity is at the core of the business model of the media production arms of the giant tech companies. The second aspect of this is the emergence of social media as a site where content can be made and shared. Social media platforms have radically lowered barriers to entry, allowing people from underrepresented communities to create and share their own self-crafted stories and experiences with the masses in a way that was impossible in the past. While it's not as obvious, diversity is shaping this context as well, and this is what I'm learning from people who are more rooted in digital media studies. Because value is created increasingly through value is made through the creation of a personal brand in order to amass followers. In this data-driven world, an individual's racial identity becomes a brand marker, which in turn is datafied through likes and shares that algorithms use to target relevant audiences in order to advertise to them more effectively. So again, we're seeing a kind of economic value attached to diversity. Presenting my racial identity is a way to accrue economic value. So I'm leaving a bit of a mess here. Diversity can seem like a progressive force. Where once they were invisible, Black, brown and Asian people are now a ubiquitous presence in the images and sounds that saturate our society, whether a party political broadcast, the front cover of a fashion magazine, a supermarket advert, a social media feed, or indeed a competitive cookery program. Historically, white institutions now strive for diversity in the boardroom. Job and promotion applications have to evidence our commitment to EDI. The very integrity and legitimacy of some of the most important cultural institutions in our society need to show that they take diversity seriously. To what extent, however, can the turn towards diversity be read as progressive? Because I'm going to argue that diversity, as a language, as a set of policies, actually serves an ideological function that keeps the status quo in place. There are two facets to this. First, in terms of media content. The super diversity that we encounter on our screens is shallow, or what Christine Warner describes as plastic representation. It presents a post-racial depiction of the world where racism appears to be overcome. While I absolutely reject a mimetic kind of understanding of media, that we evaluate its content in terms of how it measures up to society, as Stuart Hall taught us, the politics of representation is so much more complex than that. This moment of diversity, where the representation of people of colour in media strives for positivity, where black, brown and Asian people appear free from the harms of racism, this nonetheless can feel detached from the actual experiences of those communities. And social research shows time and time again how racialised communities remain structurally disadvantaged in nearly all spheres of life. Instead, through the logics of diversity, we're given this super diverse vision of society, shaped by a discourse of what Joe Littler calls post-racial neoliberal meritocracy, presenting society as a level playing field, where people racialised as other can succeed, and if they just work hard enough, where racism, it can no longer be used as an excuse. I just made a reference to super diversity there, and I'm looking at my mate Emma Jackson in the crowd. Super diversity is actually a sociological term by Stephen Vertovich, which he used to, it was a highly contested term. He used it to describe the increasingly diverse societies that we live in, where diversity is a factor. He calls it super diversity. And of course, he was criticised because he's flattening. He's flattening. He kind of, in that kind of almost slightly romanticised picture of society, racism and questions of racial inequality and disadvantage kind of get left behind. And I'm reminded, because Emma and I went to a conference on super diversity almost, 8 years ago? And at this conference on super diversity, there was a panel of not like 3 or 4 people, but like literally like 9 people up there, not one person of colour. And so Emma and I, fresh with our PhDs, stood up and stormed out. That was when that kind of, gesture politics was, cool back then, wasn't it? Not anymore. But nonetheless, so super diversity, actually, I think, I just threw it in this paper, but actually I think it really resonates with what we encounter on the screens of our media. Secondly, the reason why I'm challenging diversity as a language, as a set of policies, is in terms of cultural production. The emphasis on diversity has had little impact on persistent racial inequalities inside culture industries, despite the super visible success of a few black, brown, and Asian people. Research shows that despite the emphasis on making culture industries more diverse, the decades of initiatives aimed at increasing the number of people from those backgrounds inside media have seen little change, or maybe generously incremental improvement. It's telling that these initiatives are based on a deficit model, based upon fixing a supposed lack in people from disadvantaged backgrounds who lack training, skills, experience, networking skills, rather than deal with the racism inside those organisations, whether it's explicit forms of discrimination or a stifling creative environment that enacts tighter control on those who do not fit the somatic norm, and B, the forms of privilege and status that essentially ensure that these industries are a closed shop. In this regard, while we see super diversity on our screens, the people who monopolise the profits from this diverse content all remain the same. I can't help but think of Cedric Robinson's quote from Black Marxism. I actually changed this, but he says in the realm of the economic, he says racism, but I changed that word to diversity because it fits. It's an attempt to safeguard the interests of those deemed dominant or unraced. To illustrate this, I want to recount this really bizarre story of Tabitha Sterling. I don't know if any of you remember this story. It made the news last year. So this is a news story about a publisher behind a small independent publishing house. I did a big research project on publishing incidentally, which is why this was particularly interesting to me, who got exposed as a member of the far-right group Patriotic Alternative. It made the national news after the controversial author Judy Burchill pulled her book from Sterling's front list when she found out that Sterling is actually a white nationalist. You can see why Sterling was maybe attracted to Judy Burchill's book, Welcome to the Work Trials, How Identity Killed Progressive Politics. But what is really interesting is that before then, Sterling had published a book on black mental health called The Colour of Madness, which was actually edited by two black women activists, anti-racist activists, who also pulled their book when the news broke. So she had published a book on black mental health by two black anti-racists. And what's interesting is how that book, which was called The Colour of Madness, features in the leak, the audio leak that exposes Sterling for the fascist that she is. So in this clip, bit of context, she's being accused of being undercover Antifa by the other nationalists in the room. I'm being a bit tearful as my integrity is being questioned, and my loyalty. Those two things are very important to me. And then she adds, okay, I do have a publishing company, and I have published The Colour of Madness, as I need to make money, and that was a very in way to do it, she says. It was bound to get published. It was bound to get on the Jalak long list, which is a long list specifically for authors from racially minoritized backgrounds. I wish I'd never done it because I've only had awful, awful anti-white sentiment from all of them. Now, the publishing industry, when this news broke, and it became national news because of Judy Burchill's involvement, they were nonetheless, needless to say, were absolutely quick to kind of denounce Sterling. Already, they were already on the defensive over their own lack of diversity. But I want to argue that in her description of publishing a collection of black writers as a very in way to make money, I want to suggest that Sterling was simply following the publishing logics of the industry. Sterling appeared willing to compromise her white nationalist beliefs in order to cash in on the latest trends for black and brown voices. She was essentially following the business case for diversity. And again, rather than an act of fascism, Sterling is in fact following the very logics of diversity that shape the culture we consume. I want to emphasize, though, that in my own research, diversity is causing media industries lots of stress and anxiety. The social justice orientation of diversity does hold a disruptive quality. And in this regard, we need to understand diversity as the defensive response of the dominant culture who feels its authority, its cultural authority, under threat. But on the flip side of the coin, diversity describes the approach of major public institutions and corporations who are learning to proactively capitalize upon this new demand for racial difference, albeit with mixed results. In other words, diversity becomes a way for the dominant culture to protect its status and privilege while appearing inclusive. Diversity as a language, as a set of policies, is the way that cultural industries appear to be listening to and meeting the demands of minoritized groups, while again keeping existing hierarchies in place. So my argument is not that diversity is failing, that we need to do it better, that it needs more investment. My argument is that diversity is the problem itself. And to reiterate, this is why this paper is a call to end diversity. Last section, Uma, don't worry. I do not deny that some gains have been made through diversity. I mean, let's face it, my career has probably been enabled by diversity. But it also has had, this is I think a broader point, it's had little impact on the slide of many Western liberal democracies into authoritarianism. In fact, going to get political here again in a sec, considering the black and brown people we have in the current government, including a Home Secretary who's mobilizing brutal anti-immigrant rhetoric, then diversity arguably becomes a cover that allow such discourses to fester unchallenged. Thanks to the emphasis on diversity, racist sentiment no longer needs to be communicated through dog whistles. You can just get a person of colour to say it. To finish my talk, I want to make a case for replacing the language of diversity with a new social justice framework based around reparative justice. I'm not the first to apply this notion of reparation to media, and already I can see that I might be jumping on a bandwagon already, but that's the way academia goes. But what follows is my understanding and approach to reparative justice, which is shaped by the cultural industry's approach that has informed all of my work. So, shaped by various anti-racist, anti-imperialist movements from around the world, the call for reparations is founded on the understanding that colonialism, slavery, has had a lasting economic impact. There's an understanding as well that legacies of empire have shaped unequal relations within post-colonial nations, and also between the global north and the global south. So reparations, with an S on the end, is a specific movement based upon demands of economic, political, and material physical compensation, where the offender gives money or land that was originally taken to make amends to the victimised, often involving the ancestors of both parties. For my purposes, I work with a broader conception of reparation. For the historian Catherine Hall, if reparations with an S means compensation, reparation without the S means repair. And my own take on reparative justice builds on the idea of reparation as repair for the damage caused by slavery and colonialism, including forms of symbolic violence, the legacies of which continue to shape and mar the experiences of racialized people who originate from those regions affected by this history. So what is reparative justice in relation to media? Again, I draw from Catherine Hall, specifically her notion of reparatory history. Reparatory history is essentially a rewriting of history to undo the race thinking that constitutes modern history. Hall here refers to historians, writers, visual artists, and critical race theorists who've explored how legacies of empire shape the present through a range of different artistic, theoretical, and political interventions. It's not much of a stretch to broaden this out to cultural producers working inside cultural industries. In order to augment Hall's argument, I bring in Paul Gilroy's notion of post-colonial melancholia. This image, by the way, I don't know if you recognise it, is from Parliament Square, and it's a boarded up Winston Churchill statue following the Black Lives Matter protests. So post-colonial melancholia, according to Gilroy, is the affliction or neurosis that has produced a perennial crisis of national identity in Britain. It results in, well, firstly, Gilroy is describing how Britain's refusal to face up to its history, based upon what he calls a willful amnesia, or a convenient forgetting of the racial brutality that occurred during empire, and the inability to deal with its history is producing erotic behaviour, and it results in two things. Firstly, a fetishization of the past, an imagined homogeneous, unsullied time before immigration. And then secondly, fears over the post-colonial subject who has arrived in the imperial centre, and hostility towards their demands for recognition, fairness, and basic dignity. This produces negative consequences for those communities, but it's also bad for the dominant culture, as they suffer from this malaise. It might not be as gravely felt, but it still produces a form of alienation, and that's a reference to Frantz Fanon, who talked about how colonialism produced alienation not only in the colonised, but in the coloniser as well. And the antidote to this malaise is a form of reparatory work in the way that Catherine Hall defines. Hall is thinking specifically in terms of historical work, to repeat a way of undoing race thinking that makes up modern history. And I think cultural producers working inside culture industries play an important role in the task of not just producing positive representations of race that suits a diversity agenda, but as I prefer to phrase it, making race in a way that contributes to its undoing. making race in a way that contributes to its undoing. Write that down, Uma. Reparative justice in relation to media is about enabling the creative practices of black, brown, and Asian cultural producers to be able to speak to their histories, to their experiences, afforded the same creative freedoms as their white middle-class counterparts. This is a deliberate contrast to diversity that is happy to see racial difference, but not learn too much about racial experience. Sometimes this will produce discomfort. But, I know you're all in therapy. As any therapist will tell you, it's better to have these feelings and emotions out rather than buried within or boxed up. So what kind of policies in relation to media and culture industries, cultural industries, would be enacted in the name of reparative justice? Well, in contrast to diversity, which mostly entails soft forms of positive action, a statement on a job ad saying, we encourage people from diverse backgrounds to apply, or it entails basically constant self-flagellation inside those organisations. We need to do better. There's no people of colour here. A reparative justice framework does entail economic readdress at the level of political economy. Along the lines of classic media reform campaigning, actually. So it involves decentralising corporate power. Huge media conglomerates dominate media markets at the expense of small media companies who are trying to create something different and new. They also make standard particular types of rationalised production processes, which I've argued in my work contain within them racialising logics that hampers and stifles the politics of representation. Thus, the power of media corporates is in terms of how they monopolise market share and also set the terms and logics that all media companies, large and small, follow. And this allows the dominant culture to continue its dominance over less privileged groups. Thus, a reparative approach to media entails breaking up conglomerates on top of putting in place forms of regulation that prevent forms of corporate consolidation through vertical and horizontal integration. This is like proper media studies right now, by the way, for those of you who aren't from in that discipline. I'm also looking for economic support for independent organisations and platforms led by black and Asian groups. The purpose of more regulation is to help facilitate the development of independent cultural production, but this has to be coupled with financial support. The internet, for all of its ills, has radically lowered the barriers to entry. This has allowed racially minoritized groups and cultural producers to create amazing media that goes against the grain, experimental, alternative, sublime. You should see Latika's TikTok. It's exactly all of those things. But such new media is more likely to be embedded within, and also such new media is more likely to be embedded within their own communities, made for and by their own communities, historically neglected by mainstream media. But as the demise of Galdem, any of you know, and many other independent platforms has shown, this type of production struggles financially, producing very low rewards for labour, sometimes leading to problematic arrangements, I would argue, with corporations. Thus, media reform, according to a reparative justice framework, demands the state providing funding for such community-led media. Thirdly, we need to develop a more robust and radically inclusive public service media. Public service media, especially in the UK, has been an important space for the maintenance of social hierarchies and elite groups who get to decide what counts as culture and what does not, protecting their privilege and status in the process. But public service media, thanks to its remit that it needs to cater for its diverse community, for the diversity of the nation, makes it one of the few spaces where black and Asian people have been able to mount successful cultural political interventions. For instance, from the Black Film Workshop from the 1980s, which emerged from an arrangement between Channel 4 and the Greater London Council, to Steve McQueen's recent Small Axe series of films on black British history. And it's interesting that McQueen chose to mount those films on the BBC rather than Netflix. It has also been a hostile space, though, for such producers in terms of the everyday racism that characterises elite spaces. A radically inclusive public service media, according to the reparative justice framework, needs to be remade from the bottom up and ensure what Nancy Fraser calls parity in participation, so that all the nation's communities are able to shape and contribute to the national conversation. It also needs to be made more robust through greater public funding in order to properly buffer it from market pressures. A reparative justice framework also entails, finally, changing cultures of production inside core media. This includes challenging industry common sense, a radical reimagining of the audience who seem to be understood only in terms of one hue, and dismantling the forms of rationalization that, as I have mentioned, contain racializing tendencies that steer cultural producers into producing forms of racial stereotype on the terms of, well, that's what the market wants. It's also a discussion, it also includes, and I'm going to leave this for another day, a discussion of affirmative action. Because quite frankly, the very soft forms of positive action that make up current diversity initiatives are doing very little to improve the racial composition of the creative workforce. When I go and do interviews with people in the industry, you know, everyone's on board diversity. The minute you mention affirmative action, you get a very, very different response, which suggests to me that is the right thing to do. In a nutshell, reparative justice, as applied to media, aims to allow minoritized producers to tell the stories they want to tell in whatever way they want to tell them. Again, I remember speaking to one author, an Asian author, who just lamented he just wants to write shit science fiction, but he can't because there's an expectation that he has to write a migrant story, a story about arrival, about becoming. And it's unabashedly utopian in its goals. This is good for society as a whole, to help ease the entire nation of its post-colonial melancholia. Reparative justice helps us towards a more egalitarian future through helping us work through the past. You're going to have a go at me, aren't you, for making this mess? Looking at my mum. To conclude, I want to return to this image of this Asian punk from the Changing Faces exhibition. I like to think about this individual. To be honest with you, I kind of put it up and I've never really looked at it closely. But, you know, I think he's got that clicker thing, so it's a remote. So he's taking a self-portrait. So he's obviously been invited into the studio. I think he's got records underneath his arm. So maybe he's just come from the record shop with a new Sham 69. I know. And I like to think, you know, I can't help but notice his proud defiance here. I'd imagine both towards other white punks, but also maybe against conservative members of the Asian community. Though let's face it, he's probably an accountant now. And one of the lovely things about tonight is actually I've seen many of my students, including first years, here today, and I'm really glad you guys came. Yes, the wine will be free afterwards. But in that class, we're talking about the value of kind of scholarship, academic scholarship, and we're talking about critical thinking. And I want the spirit, I think, of this punk I think it captures the ethos of what I'm trying to encourage us all to do, which is to go against the grain and to go underneath the common sense, reject the common sense, and go underneath and find out what's really going on. But there's another reason for bringing him up. On the one hand, this image and the exhibition, because this exhibition was actually quite moving, like images from British South Asian cultural life, both public and private, some professional studio shots, others actual they got and put together an archive of personal photos for members of the community. And it speaks to the reparative history that Catherine Hall talks to. But also, as I explored in that first article in that very obscure journal, it's disturbed by the involvement of telecommunications company O2, where their logo is literally plastered everywhere on all the walls. More so, all art exhibitions, I understand, are sponsored by big corporations, but it's often much more discreet. Not least, Just Stop Oil will come in and throw paint over your paintings, right on. But nonetheless, on this occasion, it felt really pronounced. And then I found out afterwards that it was part, as I say, of their new ethnic communication strategy. So from 2003, so I think that's one of the first instances of a diversity, kind of approach. I think it's an early form of the business case of diversity. Going back to my kind of cheesy Generation X DIY indie roots, I think we need a new conversation about selling out. It seems to me that we are far too willing to succumb to our own co-option. And this is kind of ironic for those who've read any articles I've written, because I've attempted to bring nuance to crude pronouncements over the commodification of race. But I cannot help be troubled by how a creative career now is defined by receiving corporate investment, especially when the traditional ways of making a living, dare I say, selling physical product, pay so little now. It's a really hard thing to do. Nancy Fraser, building on Charles Taylor, it identifies the politics of recognition, the demand to have our fundamental identities recognised, as a key component of social justice. But under neoliberalism and the logics of diversity, the politics of recognition for racially minoritized groups appears to be measured in terms of the individual's ability to obtain a brand sponsorship deal. This is what the politics of recognition looks like, I think. The DIY scene I'm referring to, embodied in this punk, was explicitly anti-corporate. At times, this was naive, romantic, or indeed disingenuous. But the ability to stay pure is very difficult and perhaps unrealistic, but there was at least a commitment to creating alternative networks and systems, not motivated by profit, but about promoting community and producing culture in a way to enable collective flourishing. And this is why I think the framework of reparative justice offers us a solution. It performs the task of what Stuart Hall calls the recovering of lost histories, but crucially, it comes with an inbuilt critique of capitalism that recognises the economic forms of exploitation that, alongside racial subjugation, constitute modern racism. In other words, it outright rejects the business case for diversity as a way of reaching new audiences and new markets, commodifying racial difference. And it's in these terms that I argue we need to end diversity, to be replaced with an idea of reparative justice that, to paraphrase Robin Kelly, is never just about the money, but it's about repair and reconstructing the internal life of Britain. The society I'm imagining is one where racial difference is no longer something to be exploited, to be turned into a commodity, even at times for the benefit of the individual holder of a racial identity. Rather, it is a society where racial difference is something that becomes simply ordinary, that merges into the background, or even better, something that we have together chosen to leave behind. Thank you.
Well, that was unsurprisingly brilliant. I have a great book on selling out to recommend to you. Anamik and I have decided to start a new tradition for professorial inaugurals, which is no Q&A. And I'm not even going to use the excuse that there are children here, and I'm sure they're already bored out of their minds. I actually think maybe it's not appropriate for a more celebratory talk such as this. So if you really have a burning question or a comment, then maybe you should ask it over a glass of wine. Let's just hope that the catering is ready for us now. And we can instead just make our way to the food and drink. Thank you so much, Anamik.
Thank you.